And joining us now on the debate for the full hour, Mohammed Fadl, professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. Maya Schatzmiller, professor of history at the University of Western Ontario. Clifford Orwin, professor of political science at the University of Toronto. Mohammed Ali Khalidi, professor of philosophy at York University. And Janice Stein, TVO foreign affairs analyst and director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. Welcome to you all. I want to start with you, Janice, but I want to get everyone to weigh in on this. Every revolution has been carried out in the name of something. With the Americans, it was freedom. With the French, it was equality. In Russia, it was peace, bread. And I'm wondering if the Arab Spring, if it proves to turn over the existing order, what will it have been in the name of?
I think if you listen to Cairenes in the streets, they would tell you very clearly it's in the name of two things. It's in the name of rights, it's in the name of dignity. And those are the themes I think you hear over and over. There's a third one in the background, which is jobs for many of the young unemployed. But what the rallying cries have been rights and dignity.
Mohammed Fadl, how do you see that? When you hear what's going on, what do you think this is going to be in the name of in the long run?
Well, I would sort of echo what Janice says. I mean, the demonstrations, both in Tunisia and Egypt, centered around three basic terms: freedom, hurriya, karama, dignity, wa adala ijtimaiya, social justice, right? So those are the three basic demands of, I think, the demonstrators in Egypt and Tunisia, which boils down to me, I think, as, you know, forcing the state to respect the terms of the social contracts that existed in those societies.
Cliff, what about you? When you're looking at what's going on half a world away, what's this in the name of?
Well, first I'd like to say that it's not always so clear in the name of what a revolution is being carried out, in part because many different factions might participate in a revolution with very different goals. For instance, at the beginning of the French Revolution, some of the French nobility thought that they were aiming at the restoration of feudal privileges, of which the king had deprived them. And also, of course, revolutions go through phases, you know, often from the more moderate to the more radical, where you can say the principle of the revolution changes in process. So I think in retrospect, it's going to be more important to historians who wins out in these revolutions than what principles were on the lips of those who originally took to the streets to demonstrate.
Maya, you're the historian at the table. How do you see this playing out?
I would give much more weight in this analysis to the major problems that plague Arab countries. Let me give you some dimensions. First of all, if we talk about those who actually carry out the revolution, we have a majority of young people in the Arab world in general. In fact, not only a majority, but it's the highest percentage of younger people in the entire world population that we have out there. Namely, between the ages of 22 and 26, you have a huge bulge of people going through the system. And we know that during this particular age group, it is when you get most of the resources. You get education, you get healthcare. All these elements are missing in the entire Arab system. For instance, when we talk about unemployment, the Arab world has the highest unemployment rate in the entire world again. And there are two major things that are equally missing in the Arab world. This is employment. We have the highest rate of unemployment in there. And education and healthcare, they are failing this young population behind. There are a few other problems, but I will reserve them for later.
Okay. You know what's so interesting is that you all mentioned various things. Democracy was not at the top of the list. And Mohammed Ali, I want to ask you that because we hear the protesters calling for what we say is democracy. And when people in the Arab world talk about democracy, are they talking about the same concept that we here in Canada and the West are talking about?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think when Janice and Mohammed both referred to dignity, I think democracy is very much part of that. I think dignity has two dimensions when you hear it in the words of the protesters in the Arab world. One dimension of dignity is they don't feel that they are being given their due as people, as citizens, by their leaders. So there's that dimension of dignity. Their leaders just don't listen to them. And this, I think, became evident in the first few days or the first few weeks. I mean, Mubarak of Egypt was tone deaf. He would go on TV as though there was nothing. I mean, it was business as usual. I mean, he was completely in denial. So they feel like they're not being treated as people who have views, who have opinions, and so on. The other dimension of dignity is more like dignity on the international stage. And I think that they felt that Egypt, let's take the case of Egypt being sort of the paradigm case, I guess. They felt that Egypt was not treated with dignity on the world stage. They felt that they'd become a client state to the United States, basically, and their foreign policy did not reflect the people's aspirations or wishes. So, and I think, so democracy is there. It's not that it's not there, but I think the slogan of dignity is quite important here.
You know, just on that one, I would distinguish between dignity and democracy, because you can have dignity in many ways, and I worry about superimposing our own views of what our system is and assuming that we can export that kind of system to the rest of the world without paying any attention to what cultures tell us, what traditions tell us, what institutions tell us. And that's why I was very careful not to say the word democracy.
Well, I would not want my comments to be taken as a negation of the demand for democracy, because I think that all the different political currents in the Arab world that participate in these revolutions, all of them agree that democracy is the sine qua non of guaranteeing these three goals, that you can't achieve dignity, social justice, and freedom without some sort of democratic system of governance. Now, they do have profound differences on the precise contours of what kind of democracy they would have, what kinds of rights individuals should have within those democracies. But the basic fundamentals of democratic governance as a system of elections and accountability and the right to criticize freely and elect who governs you, hold them accountable. I don't think there's any dispute on those basic principles among any political actor in the Arab world today where they have the opportunity to speak. Now, if you look at Saudi Arabia, for example, people there aren't allowed to speak. Clearly, lots of Saudis want that, but they're not being given the opportunity to say so. Where Arabs are given the opportunity to demand those things, multi-party democracy, they're saying we want it, right? And this is a core element of these revolutions. And they think it's the infrastructural prerequisite to get these substantive goals.
Cliff, let me ask you, when you are hearing the chants of democracy from places where it's allowed to be chanted in the Arab world, coming from very diverse countries, but what are you hearing? Is this the same kind of democracy? Are we hearing it the same way that people intend, or their intention is to say it?
Well, chanting is cheap, especially when CNN, cameramen and microphones are nearby. I really don't know. I have to say at the outset that I'm not an expert on the Arab world, and I defer to the much greater expertise of my colleagues here who are. But I think I would ask Mohammed the question of whether Salafists are Democrats, in your view. Because obviously, you spoke of everyone in the Arab world who's able to speak, but there are many in the Arab world who are Salafists who are
What are Salafists, Cliff? Just so we're clear.
Well, I want to avoid the term Islamic fundamentalism, because I think that that's a misleading and erroneous term. What I mean by Salafists, those who wish to return what is in their return to what is in their understanding primitive and authentic Islam. So I would ask the question in the case of Egypt of the Muslim Brotherhood and whether one would rightly regard them as Democrats.
I mean,
whether the imposition of Sharia law, for instance, would correspond to notions of democratic accountability.
Yeah.
Mohammed Fadl, go ahead, and then I'll go to you, Maya.
First, with respect to the Salafists, the Salafists are a completely marginal political group. So yes, they exist. Yes, they're not democratic, but they are extremely marginal. That doesn't mean that they can't cause damage. They can incite sectarian tension, and they have, but they're not going to capture the Egyptian state, nor are they going to capture the Tunisian state. It's just not going to happen. The mainstream Islamist groups in both Tunisia and Egypt, whether the Muslim Brotherhood or the Nahda Party, distance themselves from the Salafists. Now, the more complicated question, of course, and where there's a lot of debate inside these countries is what's the precise scope, what's the precise nature of the relationship between religion and constitutional governance. That's where there's debate. Right. But I don't think that it's necessarily the case that it's either, yes, it's a theocracy, or no, it's democracy. I mean, you know, for 100 years in the American Republic, there was a Protestant establishment that governed America, and it was democratic in many sort of ways, but maybe an imperfect democracy from our standards today. And I think that will be the case in the Arab world. You're going to have institutions that don't look perfect from a liberal perspective, but they will be democratic in the sense of being representative and having accountable government.
Maya, go ahead.
I would like to point out that I think that the question is not so much the democracy question, but rather the culture of exclusions. And I'll give you an example. All Arab states have a constitution, right? They have a constitution, but the political rights and the real laws that curtail political freedoms and individual activity are being done and administered in a completely different forms. So the fact that we have a constitution there doesn't obviously guarantee all the freedoms and all the rights that are being demanded. What I think is the problem is that we have at the political regime, we have a head of state who monopolizes all the power, and not even him himself so much as the group of the people around him, whether or not legitimate players or just behind the security forces. So what do we have here is actually exclusion of civil elements from participating, from people really expressing their political views. I would like to leave the question of Islam and the religion as a whole a little bit to a later discussion, because I think it's completely, we really attribute too much power and too much significance to the element of the religion itself, and not enough to the economic problems that the Arab countries are suffering.
Okay, Maya, I'm
yes.
going to challenge you a bit because I want to go there. I want to go where you don't want to go. And I want to talk about, you know, these revolutions didn't start in December with the Tunisian leader leaving. I mean, there has been a long history that leads up to this. And Muhammad Ali, I want to ask you about this. You talk about Arab Islamic thought, and I'm wondering what you mean by that.
Well, you know, I think that we sometimes set up Islamic civilization as though it's completely different and on a parallel track to Western civilization. If you study the history of Islamic civilization, it seems to me that there's a very strong argument to be made that this is part and parcel of the West. I mean, if you study Islamic philosophy, if you study Islamic science and the advances in science and so on, they take off from the late ancient period, the Greek, Roman, Hellenistic period, and then they channel their thoughts and ideas straight into medieval Europe. So what's happened over the centuries is that that contribution, that aspect has been edited out due to political differences and military strife and so on. But there's a very strong argument to be made that Islamic civilization is not fundamentally different. It's not something that's apart from Western civilization. In many ways, it's really part and parcel of Western civilization.
But you know, just to put the cat among the pigeons, because I agree with you, all right? But if you actually look at the last 150 years, it's diverged in important ways. So if we take women, which I think in many ways is a lightning rod, and will be one of the tests about how open institutions are, how accountable they are. The difference is right now in many parts of the Middle East, including Israel, right? So I don't want to leave Israel out of this. There is a real debate about according women full equality. Now, does that debate in the West exist in the West in some cases? It certainly does, but it's a private debate. It's not a public debate anymore. We are virtually, hopefully, done with that. That's not true yet in many parts of the Middle East, and that's going to be, you know, Saudi women drivers may seem funny to everyone, but it's actually not. And in Egypt, I think, I'm a little less optimistic than you are, Mohammed, because I think those will be some of the, you know, the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, has multiple tendencies within it. It's not monolithic. And one of the interesting things about what we're seeing now, Pia, is those differences are starting to emerge as different candidates emerge. So we're going to hear many voices from the Brotherhood. But nevertheless, there's a huge debate around whether women should be running in what could there be a woman president? That's one of the debates that I've been watching among the leaders of the brothers, and there are strong voices that say absolutely not. So I don't want to use the word democracy, I'm much more interested in rights. Do we in fact have anything like equality rights? That's a longer term project. It's not this fall.
Okay, everyone wants to chime in here, so Mohammed Fadl, you start.
You know,
Okay.
again, it's very important to distinguish countries from countries. So it's a very country-specific
Yes.
issue. Saudi Arabia is an extreme outlier, right?
Yeah.
If you look at Tunisia, Nahda, the so-called Islamic party, right, has signed off on an election law that requires each party to have a list of 50% female candidates, right? Okay, so you have an Islamic party endorsing an election law that requires them to field 50% female candidates, right? Yes, it's true. Some elements of the Muslim Brotherhood, the official leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood, is against the idea of having either a Christian president or a female president. But they are not opposed to the Constitution giving them that right, and they have said that they will accept the legitimacy of either a female president or a Christian president, but they will not support, they will not nominate one, right? So I think it's very important to distinguish, going back to this thing about rights, versus their own sort of internal position. They have a doctrinal objection to this, but they're not saying that this delegitimates the legal system that recognizes these rights. And of course, it's not a uniform view among all Islamist groups in Egypt, much less Islamist groups all across the region. So we have to be very, very careful about that.
You know, just to quickly fill in, Mohammed and I were talking about one outstanding candidate who has, in a sense, just moved out of the official umbrella of the Brotherhood, is running for president, who's open in his advocacy of equal rights for women. So it's a more nuanced conversation than we're hearing, but it's still a really tough one, I think.
Okay, Cliff, go for it.
Yeah, I really have to question the parallel that Muhammad established between the United States and the Muslim Brotherhood. Yes, America was a primarily Protestant country, but from the very beginning, the American state was of no religion. Both the federal government and the state governments were of no religion from the revolutionary beginnings. And there was no established church in America, so the state did not have the powers or authority of a church, and the church did not have the authority or powers of the state. That's crucial. That's not the way in which the Muslim Brotherhood, as I understand them, views the world. They want an Islamic state, right? Whatever intermediate stages they might be willing to tolerate on the way there is one thing, but their goal is an Islamic state, right? Which as such is neither a secular nor, in Western terms, a tolerant state. Granted that there's a wide range of opinion among those who favor an Islamic state, and granted that the Salafists are just one extreme of those who favor one, I think that that is a fundamental question. And in that crucial respect, I think one does have to say that the Muslim Brotherhood is theocratic rather than democratic, and that one can't really combine those two successfully.
I want to come back to the question of the women, because I think it's fundamental to the situation that we have. The exclusion of half of the adult population from participating fully in the workforce, from getting education, from getting health, is in the base, is the root of the conditions that we find now in the Arab world. Namely, the fact that you have so many adults not participating in the labor force is clearly retarding all the rest of the subject that we are talking about. For instance, if you talk about population growth, right? It's the worst rate, I would say the worst, because it's very dangerous for the state, growth rate is in the Arab world. It used to be 6.3% yearly. Now it has gone down to 3, but when you compare it to the Western world, where you have 1.1 or not at all replacement, you can see how damaging is the population growth for the progress, economic progress of this country. It's keep eating every time we have some economic growth. And the root reason for this is conditions of women. An educated woman will not have so many children, will know more about birth control, and would like to have a career. So the empowerment of women, extremely important issue for the
Okay,
entire
we're going to
debate.
talk more about economics in a bit, but Muhammad Ali, I'm trying to figure out, because I think there is a lack of understanding, a bridge that we need of how we sort of got to today and the problems that we've been talking about and the challenges that are ahead. So can you help me out and explain to me sort of the main pillars of Arab Islamic thought, so we can all have the conversation when Cliff challenges us on the difference between that and Western democracies? Help me out, explain that to me.
Well, there's a great deal of diversity. I mean, we tend to treat the Islamic world as a monolith, as though there are these, you sometimes hear these principles, well, in Islam, there is no separation of religion and state, whereas in Western Christian thought, there is. Well, it's simply not true. I mean, if you look at earlier Islamic eras, there were lots of political institutions that were de facto separate from religious institutions. And even though they might have paid lip service to Islam, were secular in essence. So I don't buy a lot of these slogans that you sometimes hear about how Islam is sort of fundamentally different from the West in this respect. And this also goes to things like women's issues, and also goes to things like the issue of democracy. I mean, the issue of democracy, I would say, is not completely settled in the West yet. I would say women's empowerment is not something that's completely settled in the West. The United States or Canada are certainly superior to Saudi Arabia in terms of women's rights. But are they perfect? I'm not so sure. You know, is that exactly the model that every state in the Arab world should follow? In some ways, yes. In some ways, perhaps not. So I think we have to be careful in somehow thinking that the Arab world or the Islamic world are fundamentally different in these respects.
Cliff, I have to say, the look on your face, I don't know if we saw you there when Muhammad Ali was talking, but you disagree with what he's saying. Do you not?
I hate to wear my heart on my face.
Don't play poker, my friend.
I apologize. I don't. I don't. I'm willing to defer to his superior expertise. And in fact, I know enough about the history of the Arab world to know that what he just said is true about how even in the Middle Ages, there were institutions in the Arab world that were largely independent of Islam, including for a crucial period, philosophic thought, very importantly so. But it still seems to me one has to say that, as was true of every pre-modern Western society, that's important to remember, nonetheless, you never had in Islam a secular state. And therefore, you never had what we understand as religious toleration. You had de facto toleration of non-Muslim groups, in fact, regulated by law, but they enjoyed the status of the dhimmi, which was an inferior status, right? Not a status of civic equality, such as characterizes the modern Western principle, and then increasingly in practice. So I think that in considering these differences, one shouldn't lose the forest for the trees.
You know, and just to extend the conversation, to follow on Muhammad Ali's point that democracy in the West is not a finished project. What we've learned in the last 25 years, elections are not the be-all and the end-all. They do not guarantee democracy in any way. It's a much deeper problem, and we've seen over the last 20 years, I think, brutally disappointing results even after elections. There's something, and this is the real question, is there a rule of law? Is there an independent judiciary? And here Egypt has a very, I think, is in a very strong position, actually, to lead the Arab world, because it has the most outstanding judiciary in the Arab world. But an independent judiciary really matters here that can withstand the power of a president, the power of parliament. Accountability, do leaders voluntarily hand over power when they lose? It's very easy when they win, but it's the next time around. Do they hand over power when they lose? These are all huge questions, and we're at the very, very beginning of an early process. In Iran, there were elections. Let me put it to you that way.
What I would say is, of course, democracy is always a project in progress. And so I think the most important thing is not the first elections, but the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, right? And so I think the problem here is whether we're going to establish a yardstick of perfection to these regimes. As I've said from the very beginning, Egypt nor Tunisia is going to be Canada, right? They have to start from where they are. They have to start where civic culture is and build from there, right? That's why, from the perspective of an advanced liberal democracy, their constitutions may look to be imperfect. But there is one thing that I want to say to Erwin. it's true in a literal sense when you say that in Islamic history there's not a distinction or a separation between the secular order from the religious order. But that, in my opinion, happens to do more with the coincidences of institutional history of Christianity in Europe than any kind of normative issue. Because within Islamic law itself, it makes these internal distinctions between religious affairs and secular affairs. So as a scholar of law, I have a hard time understanding how Islamic law, which self-consciously hives off ritual from everything else, isn't a secular body of law, right? It can be understood the way that any secular lawyer understands any secular law. So the problem we have in a place like Egypt is when a group calls for the establishment of Islamic law, what exactly do they mean by that, right? You can use Islamic law, I think, as a great resource for civil rights, for human rights, et cetera, for good governance, et cetera. Also, you can use it to establish a religious state in the sense that you're talking about. But what I'm saying is that that is a completely unfinished project.
It's an open question.
And Islamic modernism, which is something that I've been writing about in connection with these revolutions, right? One of the whole purposes of Islamic modernism was to cabin very carefully, right, the religious element from the secular element of Islamic law, and say it's the secular element that we need to develop, modernize, and to make it a workable legal system for the modern world. And so I think a lot of the issues that you were talking about, the Nahda, the Renaissance, the 19th century Renaissance, effectively tried to resolve a lot of those problems. And so I think there's a really good historical base from which these countries can progress forward, right? But yes, they're not at the same liberal stage of equality, but neither were democracies in the 19th century or even pre-World War II democracies. So I think these new democracies have to be given a fair shake.
Muhammad Ali, I want to give you a chance to respond to what's been said, but I want to ask you this. Are we at the point now where the philosophical outlooks between the West and the Arab Islamic world are close enough that an open conversation is even possible? Because we are certainly not going to leave the Arab world alone to do this by themselves. That's not the way we do things in the West.
Yeah, but I think one thing that we really need to make sure doesn't happen is that the United States or Canada or any of the other Western powers comes in and says, okay, let's teach you how to be democratic. I mean, that's a non-starter. That's really going to backfire. And I think that maybe after the George Bush adventure in Iraq, maybe the West knows to back off a little bit. I think there's a lot of room for individuals. I think there's a lot of room for institutions of civil society to get involved. I think there's a lot of room for non-governmental organizations to cooperate with non-governmental organizations in the Arab world in developing these kinds of institutions. But I don't think it's right, given the recent history, for the state, the government of Canada or the United States to try and get involved in injecting its version of democracy into the Arab world.
You see, I think that's a really crucial point, and that's where I started earlier. When I said the real risk here, Pia, is that we think of democracy as an exclusively Western liberal project that looks like us. And we say to others, we'll help you look more like us. That will fail. That, I'm convinced, will absolutely fail. There are specific things, and we have to wait to be asked. So if you take Egypt, for example, there is a very active community, really strong, of human rights organizations that are Egyptian-led, that are strong on the ground, really well organized, very impressive. Not as strong on political parties, for good reasons, because you couldn't do it under Mubarak. So issues like, how do you finance a political party? How do you organize? What about, do you want a single party past the post? Do you want proportional representation? Do you have a riding association? There's some very nutsy, boltsy things, which if we're asked, we can say there are a number of different ways of doing. But the purpose is not for Egypt to look like us when this is done.
Okay, let me ask somewhat of an uncomfortable question, and I want all of you to discuss this, but I want to start with you, Mohammed Fadel, and I want to ask you this. It's a toughie. Is Islam even compatible with democracy? I'm just asking the questions.
Well, I think, as is the case with any broad tradition, you can find interpretations that are and interpretations that aren't. And I think Islam and democracy are equally both very broad traditions. And so when you speak of Islam, you have to specify which conception of Islam. When you speak of democracy, which conception of democracy? And so at that level of generality, I mean, I know that lots of people in the audience and in the media out there sort of want this, an answer to this question, but it's really sort of not a meaningful question the way that it's posed. I think it's much more meaningful to pose very discrete questions and start worrying about it at that level.
You know, can I jump in? That is the question people ask all the time. There's a terrific book, actually, written on Islamic law, which Mohammed knows very well, which viewers would love, written by Quran, and a Turkish scholar. And it's a really interesting discussion of property rights and how the way Islamic law at different points in history thought about property rights and whether that got in the way of the evolution of modern capitalism in the Arab world. You know, and it's a nice commentary on Max Weber and the whole issue of Protestantism and the rise of capitalism. So at some points in history, some versions of law make it easier to engage in some kinds of economic activity. At other points, it actually gets in the way.
You've gotten yourself in trouble now.
I know, I've gotten myself in trouble. I can see it.
Gasps and chuckles from this side of the table.
Whether you agree on the details or not, that's an argument, actually, which is interesting. It's been made in the West. That Protestantism made it easier to engage. I mean, that's why in Protestant Europe, capitalism led and Catholic Europe followed behind. There are similar arguments in the Arab world that are going on, whether you agree with this one or not. And I think that's the crucial question. Which version of Islamic law, and how much space is that going to make as this debate goes forward?
Maya.
There are a few things I need to say here. First of all, with regard to the Timur Quran thesis, that is completely wrong. It's wrong from so many points of view that I even don't know even where to begin. But let me simply summarize it. What Timur Quran is basically doing, he looks at everything that the West has done, and then he looks at Islamic law and he says Islamic law blocked all these things by not changing properly in time. It blocked progress forward for Muslims.
Capitalist progress.
All progress on all aspects,
Okay.
on all business. He starts with business, he goes to property right, and basically his idea is that Islamic law blocked. This is the recent book. Why is it wrong? It's wrong because the European model is the only model. No other society broke out of the framework in the 15th century as European, Dutch, and British have done. And they led the way, what we call the long divergence, where everybody else stayed behind. They broke the way. So as a result of it, we're all looking forward to see what can we learn from the European model. But beating on Muslim and Islam, why they haven't changed precisely in this way is completely wrong. Why should they? Why should they? Let me jump right into another question, historically speaking here. Islamic law, and this is a topic that I have been working for quite some time, actually made the great economic progress of Muslim during the medieval period possible. Muslim achieved a great deal of financial development, of economic progress during the medieval period. And this could not have been possible without Islamic law. The formation of Islamic law during the 8th, 9th, 10th century actually made all these achievements possible. Now, to look and ask why Islamic property rights or corporation law, which he likes very much, did not develop, did not change precisely at the moment that Europe did in order to allow it, is really unreasonable from every point of view.
Okay, I'm going to hold you up there.
Yes.
I want to shift gears a little bit and try this one out on you folks. I want to read a quote from a book by Khaled Abu al-Fadl. Take a listen to this quote. Here's what it said. For Islam, democracy poses a formidable challenge. Muslim jurists have argued that law made by a sovereign monarch is illegitimate because it substitutes human authority for God's sovereignty. But law made by sovereign citizens faces the same problem of legitimacy. In Islam, God is the only sovereign and the ultimate source of legitimate law. How then can a democratic conception of the people's authority be reconciled with an Islamic understanding of God's authority, he asks. Mohammed Fadl, start us off. How do you answer that question?
Sadly, I think he's mistaken, right? I think it's a commonly held notion, but it's just plain wrong. If you read medieval treatises of Islamic law, I think the concept is clear that the state is acting as a public agent. And we obey the state because it's our agent, the same way that the acts of an agent bind me as a principal. If I've appointed him to be my agent, and the agent acts within the scope of his appointment, then his actions bind me. The same analogy was used to understand the public acts of the state, all right? And so the state acts for our collective good, right? As long as it acts within the scope of the delegation, which is defined by certain mandatory standards of Islamic law, and that's why we obey it. We don't obey it because the sovereign is acting on behalf of God. He's acting on behalf of us. Now, what's true and what becomes problematic from the perspective of modern liberal theory is there's an assumption that the limits of the delegation are bound by certain immutable standards of Islamic law. Okay, so it's not a people, a natural people that's unconstituted by any kind of moral conception. There is a moral conception that's derived from Islam, but nevertheless, political authority derives from a contractual appointment from the people to the ruler, and he's considered to be their agent. And that principle is found throughout the positive law of Islam.
Cliff, from your position of looking at Western political theory, what do you make of what Mohammed is saying there?
I'm struck by the fact that one could have said something like the same thing about Christian Europe. Prior to the age of divine right monarchy, which in fact was a reaction against the authority of the papacy, there was an understanding of the king as an agent of the people who somehow had the commission of the people, right? Exactly how wasn't entirely clear. But of course, under God. So under God is interpreted by Christianity, whose authoritative spokesman was not the king, but the church. Right? So you had a kind of theological political problem similar to the one that one finds in Islam. But as you acknowledge, it is a problem, right? And the question is how one resolves it, right, in such a way to go forward politically. It seems to me that the Christian distinction between spiritual and temporal was not the same as the modern distinction between church and state, but lent itself to be reinterpreted by clever thinkers like Locke, who invented the modern understanding of church and state. That was one way of going forward, which was open to Christianity, Protestant Christianity anyway. It's not clear to me that resolution is available to Islam. I'd be curious to know what you think about that.
Again, it seems an unfair allegation, Pia, entirely, that Islam and democracy are incompatible because all authority comes from God. The real question is, how does that authority get expressed, right? If you're a believer, how does that authority get expressed? Cliff is right. There are European precedents for this argument. And in case we think we're through this, the European Union just had a raucous debate over whether under the sovereignty of God would be included in the European Charter. And that's in the last 10 years. So that's an ongoing discussion. So the very fact that people are believers does not make it incompatible with democracy. Take the most rambunctious state of them all, Israel. It is a state in which significant chunks are under a religious law, but nevertheless, it has a thriving set of democratic institutions and a Supreme Court which butts up against the religious establishment. So the answer is, it's not going to come wholly in theory, although I agree with Cliff and disagree with Maya profoundly. The Protestant example in Europe was not a fluke. It led the way, and if you actually look at the economic problems in the Arab world today, which we all agree are probably the biggest threat to democracy, I think not Islam, I think it's the huge economic challenge. Egypt has to create 10 million jobs in the next 10 years, or it will disappoint. That is a function of law, in part.
I just want to pick up on a couple of things. One is, I'm not an expert on Islamic law, but I know a little bit about Islamic political thought. And these debates about democracy, about the literal interpretation of the Quran, about how do you reconcile science with religion? I mean, these were very lively debates 1,000 years ago. The Islamic philosophers that I read, for instance, one of them, Al-Farabi, writing in Baghdad in the 10th century, a millennium ago, was very enthusiastic about democratic system of government. And he said, and he broke with Plato. He's a great admirer of Plato's, and he doesn't even explicitly say I'm breaking with Plato on this point, but he clearly does. And he says, look, democracy is the second best form of government because it is the one that will eventually lead us to the perfectly just society. And it's one in which you have sub-communities that can be just and so on. So he had a great deal of admiration for democracy 1,000 years ago, when most thinkers in Europe would have abhorred the idea. And of course, Plato's legacy was very profound, and he thought democracy was, second worst to tyranny. It was this awful system where everyone was free and it was complete chaos. There were also lively debates about how do you reconcile science and religion. And again, there were Islamic philosophers who would say, look, when there's a direct conflict between what science tells us and what religion or the Quran says, you've got to interpret the Quran allegorically. There's just no two ways about it, because God gave us the faculty of reason, and he told us to go out and investigate the natural world, and he wouldn't have done something to us that's going to lead us into error. He wouldn't have given us the faculty of reason that's led us to these conclusions if that was going to end up with us making mistakes. So the Islamic world is cognizant of these issues, and it's been cognizant of them for a long time, and it's not like we have to sort of wake up and suddenly deal with all these kinds of conceptual questions.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes or so left, I think, and I just want to change gears a little bit, because one thing I think we do have consensus on around the table is one of the fundamental issues we're facing in all of these revolutions is this idea of unemployment and the economy. And Maya, you raised it earlier, so let me start with you on this one. Economic development is key for any meaningful change to come about. In thinking about the Arab world's need to change and reverse several hundred years of relative economic stagnation and decline, what historical precedent are you looking to?
I'll tell you something. I was thinking about it, really the beginning of the decline or the beginning of the blockage actually occurred in the 19th century with the drive for westernization, secularization, modernization that took place under the Ottoman Empire and later on progressed into independent states. What the Ottomans has done is to begin reformation and begin progress by empowering the army. All the money and all the resources went in making the army modernized and give it more and more power, whether it's arms, whether it's uniform, whether it's recruitment, and so on. When we have the stage when the Ottoman Empire dissolved and we start to have independent regimes in the Middle East and the Arab world, it was the army that eventually took power. Each one of the governments that we are witnessing today falling flat on their face is ruled by a general, ruled by a military leader. So the first thing that we have to do is actually to realize that this group of people, the officers, actually blocked the development, the economic development of the Arab countries. They monopolized power of decision, they monopolized the resources, they allow corruption, all in the name of nationalism, because they are the ones who inherited the mantle of the nationalist leader, and they invest all the power in their own infrastructure, which is the military. So this is the beginning, I think, of everything.
I think the role of the military and the amount of resources it extracted from more productive use, that's clearly a part of the story, but I don't think it's the only part of the story, frankly.
What is the rest of the story?
So what's the rest of the story?
Not the rest, maybe, Janice, maybe part of the story.
Well, you had, in fact, certainly, first of all, you had colonial period, which we haven't talked about. And that was also a period in which resources were extracted. from productive use in the economy by and large, and not invested at the same time as other parts of the world were moving forward. That's a second big piece. Thirdly, as I said, there were still some legal obstacles, although most of those are gone, frankly, by the 19th century. Fourth, and this is really interesting, you really did not have in a serious way until recently, and this is, I think, probably Egypt's biggest challenge, you did not have the transformation from a rural economy to a manufacturing economy, but you had population growth. And that's the trap, because and you know, Egyptians like Naguib Sawiris, who is one of the outstanding figures in the business community in Egypt, talks about this. You know, and he's the president of its largest telecom company. He's the Apple of Egypt, or the rim of Egypt, and fundamentally, that doesn't create jobs. No matter how high tech it is, no matter how sophisticated it is, it doesn't create jobs. Egypt has not gone through, and it could, given its labor costs. It did not go the Chinese path, which was to create large numbers of manufacturing jobs created with a comparative advantage, less labor. That has to be the priority in the next 10 years if any Egyptian president, no matter who the person is, he or she, is going to meet the expectations.
Cliff, what's the key here to get the Arab world out of its economic rut? Is it the military? Is it politicians? Where do we start?
I'm not going to answer that question.
Wait a minute.
Being an American by birth, I'm going to invoke the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination.
You're on
Not
Canadian
being
soil.
expert on economic history, I'll leave it to those who are.
I happen to agree a lot with what Maya said. I mean, I think that what you see in Egypt is the fruit of a generation of really poor economic policy making. And there's a good news story to that, which means there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of creating social and economic efficiencies, so long as there's political will. Now, that's a big question mark. But you could have dramatic increases in Egyptian productivity if fairly simple decisions were made. Now, it's going to cross a lot of vested interests, right? But we know what needs to be done. There are a lot of easy things that can be done in Egypt to greatly improve the situation of the average Egyptian and the overall performance of the Egyptian economy.
To create jobs.
Well, that's true. But in the long term, the basic problem in Egypt right now is that you don't have a skilled labor force. Egypt, unfortunately, is in this middle position where it cannot compete on price. That means it can only compete based on skills. But the Mubarak regime did not invest in the skills of the Egyptian population. So it's going to take time to restore the human capital of Egyptian society. But Egypt has its own stores of wealth. It can invest in its population and increase their skills. That requires political will, and hopefully with some sort of democratic institutions, that political will will be mobilized.
I think here there's a nefarious role that the West has played. In the form of the institutions of the World Bank and the IMF. I mean, I think these organizations tend to impose, not just in the Arab world, but in many parts of the developing world, certain kinds of standards that have been inimical to real economic development. I mean, their mantra is basically cut subsidies, don't worry about redistribution of wealth, grow, grow, grow. Now, growth is not everything. I mean, Egypt was growing economically. It had a healthy growth rate, according to the IMF and the World Bank. But what was not happening was no investment in things like education, because that creates a larger state sector, and the IMF and the World Bank are wedded to neoliberal economics, which means very small state spending and no accounting for redistribution of wealth.
Maya, you disagree?
Yes, yes. Over the last 20 years, there is a decline everywhere in the economies in each of the Arab states, and that's include even the oil-producing ones. In Egypt in particular, but in many other Arab countries, the problem is that a third of the labor force is employed in the public sector. This is notoriously a sector that is deadlocked, right? Private enterprise is very, very limited. Mohammed referred to the human capital, basic problems there, no skills, no technical education, and no health care. people who are not fed properly. And the biggest problem, poverty. 50% in some countries in the Arab world live below the poverty line, below the $2 thing. This is not good background to produce any economic growth, for that matter whatsoever. A decline in industrialization occurred in Egypt for the last 20 years. There are now less factories and less productivity than used to be 20 years ago. The paradoxical thing is when they measured, the Arab Development Report measured the air, the quality of air in the Arab countries as well. Below the problem, beside the problem of water insufficiency, they also measured the air. The quality of the air, the air pollution in the Arab world is the best in the world. So everybody would say, oh, wonderful. But the reason is there is no factories there. There's no industrialization. So it's really not such a very good
I just want to
outcome.
underline that point. That's a really crucial point. You cannot meet the economic needs of a growing population. Egypt is now 90 million people, right? You cannot do this based exclusively on a rural economy. And a rural economy which has never really been productive. It has fallen behind in terms of the kind of investments in efficient agriculture. So it's going to be a huge challenge for these. And I worry, frankly, my biggest worry, if you ask me, my biggest worry about the next 10 years is not which president it's going to be. It's, are we going to get the investment in the skills that Egypt needs to move and become a manufacturing economy? Because if it's not, it's going to disappoint those thousands of young men who are in Tahrir Square.
Okay, we just have about 2 minutes left, and I want to pick up from what Janice just said. You know, it's called the Arab Spring. We're now in summer. We'll be in fall and winter, and probably before we see the end of this and how it all turns out.
Decade.
Okay, let's call it the Arab decade. Mohammed Fadel, what are you looking for in the coming months, broad strokes, to be key indicators if we're on the right track?
Do we get constitutions in Egypt and Tunisia? Right? Are the parliamentary elections that are being that are scheduled to occur in Egypt and Tunisia this fall, do they occur successfully? Does everybody accept the results? And then do they then proceed to the constitutional assemblies? Right? I'm very optimistic that they will. Right? But if it's going to be derailed, I think it's going to be derailed there, because we're going to see for the first time, will the people accept the results of the elections? Everybody, not just one group or the other, but everybody has to be prepared to accept the results of those initial elections.
Cliff, what are you looking for?
I really don't know.
That's twice now.
I'll just say this. I think back just 5 or 6 years to a similar period of heady optimism, the color revolutions, right? The Ukraine, Lebanon, Georgia, where are they now? None of them is anywhere where any lover of democracy would want them to be. So I think that one has to be similarly reserved about one's expectations from the so-called Arab Spring.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We'll come back in 10 years and see where we're at. Everyone will be back? Okay, good promises. Janice Stein, the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Clifford Orwin, Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Mohammed Ali Khalidi, Professor of Philosophy at York University. Maya Schatzmiller, Professor of History at the University of Western Ontario. And Mohammed Fadel, Professor of Law at the University of Toronto. Thank you all very much.